Hi, welcome to my first ever YouTube video. I recorded some content last year with hopes to do this year, and I can't wait to share this fairy stump jar that I built last year for a friend of mine. I ended up shipping it out to her, and I'm so happy with how it turned out. I thought I could go over some of the basics of how I built it if you are interested in making one for yourself. I've done a couple similar things to this now, and I'm really happy with how they turned out. So I start with a glass jar. She actually really wanted this flip lid jar. I find it very difficult to work with. I would definitely recommend a screw-on lid jar for this. I then use a Sculpey clay, like a clay bake polymer clay. So I'll later bake the jar to harden the clay. Could also be done with an air dry clay. Then I got a couple tools that I'll link below that I got from Amazon. I just found this a lot easier to dedicate them to using clay so I didn't get them dirty with other things. And then as well, I used some alcohol wipes to clean everything up so that I often found I get a lot of hair in the clay and everything, so this kind of just helps a little bit with that. I always just start with cleaning some of my tools and my workspace just to make it a little less hair free, but you can always pick some little pieces of hair out or use alcohol wipes on the clay as you're going to make it a lot easier. Don't need anything too fancy with the tools. I just got a collection of two things. I wanted to try some of the plastic, the blue tools you see there, and then I got these cool ones with the wood handles. Honestly, definitely not necessary. I just done a jar or two like this before, and I thought this could be a fun addition to trying this out. The clay's always really tough to work with at the start, so I try to warm it up in my hands and kind of move it around so that it's easier to use for the rest of the time instead of doing it in little sections. Kind of gets my hands a little sore, but I find that it's really helpful in the long run. And I'm trying to coat the entire jar with a bit of clay, but I didn't want it to be using too much clay, so I try to get it as thin as I can with the roller first to put it on the jar. I did find that it ended up being a little bit hard to get off my mat to then put on the jar. So I kind of veer off that a little bit, sometimes placing some thinner pieces at a time and spreading them out as far as I can. And then I just proceed to cover the whole jar, and this probably is one of the most time-consuming things, so I just do it until it's fully covered. Once I have the entire jar covered, so I actually drew up a really cute plan for this. She saw a mushroom jar that I had done previously and kind of just said, do what you like with this. Very fairy, woodland, witchy vibes. And I drew up a really cool plan for this, for it to look like a stump fairy home with mushrooms and crystals and moss. So I'll show a picture of that right here. So the next step for me was to add kind of this bark standing up around the edges of the lid, because I want the stump to go fully up, have a little bit of bark height, and then you're looking down into the rings of the stump. So what I'm creating here is that bark ledge along the thing. So I didn't want it too thick because I wanted it to be very cool looking, a little bit of dimension, but not too heavy, but thick enough that it was gonna withhold being baked and stand up somewhat strong. Then I just smoothed down the edges as best I could, and then I thought a cute little character to add to it with some little notches out of the bark that was standing up on the edges, so some little kind of triangle pieces and some little slits going down. So that's what I did here. Once I finished all of that, this was a couple day project, so I had left it to sit for a bit. So this is just me getting ready for the next day of working on it, cleaning up my station a little bit. I had a lot of detail work that I wanted to get done, but I just started by clearing out kind of around the lid. Probably my biggest fear with all of this was that the lid being able to open and close without damaging the clay, since it's kind of a forceful lid shutting. But I was really happy with how the lid was turning out, so I wanted to continue on that. So I actually started doing the rings of what the tree would have on the top of the stump. It's a little hard to see the white on white in this camera, but that's essentially what I'm doing here, and I'm actually really happy with it, how it turned out. And it wasn't as crazy time consuming as I thought it might be. I will go on to add these tree lines on the bark later on, but since I won't be grabbing or handling this top part of the lid, I thought it was best I start with the lid part. I then go in to carve this crescent moon shape into the side of the tree. I wanted it to look like somebody had carved it into the actual tree and kind of carved away the bark. So I just kind of planned that out. I always try to do moons by doing a full circle first and then carving a smaller circle out of the center so it's like somewhat even. But for this I didn't need it to be super precise because I wanted it to look like somebody had hand carved it on the tree. Again, it's not like super easy to see with the white on white, but once I had shaped it out by kind of lightly putting lines on the clay, I then used this tool with kind of a triangle hole to carve out some of the excess so that it was definitely deeper into the bark than just on the surface. So I was happy with the moon. I thought it was time to start doing the bark lines. So I started around the moon kind of doing the different pieces, and then I tried to do these really long strokes going down and then filling in between where I thought there was too big of space in between the lines, and kind of cutting some in half and pulling to the bottom. And again, white on white clay, it's really hard to see, but this really comes alive when I start to paint it. This was definitely a little bit time consuming, but I do not regret doing it at all. I think it really makes the jar and made it super cool. I just throw on TV show, enjoy myself, pretend like it's relaxing, even if it's not. But I was so excited for how this jar was going to turn out that it didn't really matter to me if that took a long time. It's not something I might ever do again, so I just really wanted to put my all into this one jar. And then as you can see, I also did do the lines up on the jar, as that is the bark, or sorry, up on the lid, as that is the bark going up onto the lid. I did it in two separate kind of pieces because there is kind of a gap in between. And then it's time for some mushrooms. So I chunked up some of the clay into little pieces as for my stems, and then the tops of the little mushrooms. I was just hoping for those little red mushrooms with the little white dots on them, but I wanted varying size of stems so that they kind of stuck up from the top of the lid as well as on the side of the jar. I was a little nervous about the weight of these, so I tried to make the tops not as big because I want them to go off the side of the jar and kind of look like they're growing out and up a little bit, defying gravity. I really did all I could to make this the cutest little ethereal jar ever, so I think mushrooms is like one of the best things I could add to it, and like enough to make it very foresty. And then it gets even better when I add the moss and the crystals. So I kind of individually shaped the tops, nothing too crazy. I wanted them to look decently natural, even though I do paint things very cartoony. And then I gave them kind of a flat bottom and kind of a peak top, and I dented a little hole in the bottom to allow the stem to kind of push in and really attach. I did start off adding the little underlines to a mushroom. I believe after I kind of put in the stem and shoved them in, they didn't really stay the lines that I wanted them to be, and I kind of had to re-add them after the stem goes in. So you can probably skip a step, put the stem in, and then do your little lines on your mushroom. As well as I do like the little lines that come down onto the stem, like a little frill around the top of the stem where it connects. So you might as well do this at the same time. As you might have seen in my drawing, I also drew some little white toadstools that I wanted to kind of build in little steps along the edge of the stump. I thought these would be a really cute addition, so this is me kind of just flattening out pieces. I made them kind of thinner and wavier around the edges, and then the back is kind of a flat, thicker piece so that it would adhere well. But I make a couple of these and then attach them on where I want them as well. I kind of score the edges of things when I go to adhere them to the jar, as well as the place where they're going to go on the jar. It's something I kind of learned a long time ago when working with pottery a bit. I don't know how much it helps, but it can't hurt, so I just do a couple little lines and crisscrosses on the piece to make it a little bit rougher, and do the same on the spot where I want it. Then I try and push it in there as nicely as I can without ruining my shape, but once it's on and you feel it's pretty sturdy, it is easy to remold the edges of the little piece and make it how you want it and exactly what size. I was so excited with how these are turning out, so I did take a lot of time to appreciate them. I think they're so cute and they really add to the whole thing. It's just adorable. I also went on to add lines to the bottom of these guys, just giving them that same little mushroom look underneath, some texture to them. And the same goes for attaching the mushrooms. I did a little bit of a score where they were going and a little bit of a score on the bottom of the stem. I started by placing some on top. I just wanted to see how they went. There's not as much gravity pulling them down since I'm sticking them kind of straight up, a little bit curved here and there. but I wanted some little mushroom clusters on the top. I thought that would be really cute. And I thought, if anything, they were going to hold up the best, so I wanted to start with those ones. Didn't plan out the placement of the mushrooms super particularly. I kind of just placed them in little clusters and kind of worked with that and tried to see how I liked it and wanted it to be decently weighted, and just kind of saw where they were. I believe I maybe made some more mushrooms if I needed them, but I just kind of made a random number and hoped it worked out. The ones on the edge worked out decently well with the kind of curve that I did on them. I would definitely recommend doing shorter stems on the ones on the edge just to stop them from falling off so much as they were waiting to bake, or doing them as quickly as possible and making sure you fix them in the exact spots you want and baking them as soon as possible. I did find a little bit of distortion, and some of them were falling a bit by the time that I had gotten them into the oven. Some of them may have baked in a different position than I was planning. I then went around with this little kind of pinpoint tool that I'd been using to carve lines and just pushing down some of the clay around the bottom of the stems to make sure that it had a little bit more of a surface pushed into the clay below so that they were definitely connected. Sorry if you're forced to hear any little squeaks in the background. I definitely did this around a bad time to voice over. It's definitely the dog's walk time, and Rosa is squeaking her toy furiously at me, trying to get me to pay attention to her. So this is post-bake of the jar. I find it really hard to bake. I bake based on the directions on the jar or on the package of the clay. But as you can see, I've got some major cracks in it, especially around where the jar lid opens and closes. It's really difficult to judge the amount of time to put it in for when things are such different size or thicknesses. I did also lose some mushrooms. It was very sad. Some things kind of tilted ways that I didn't want to. As you can see, that mushroom on the top is very tilted to the left. But I'm gonna go forward with everything. I do plan on doing an epoxy coating, so I think that'll adhere a lot of things really well. One of the big things that I found that I was really excited were these little crystals. I actually found them in the bead section of Michael's. So they do have a little hole through all of them, but it's not very noticeable, and they are all real little clear quartz. I thought these would be a really cool addition to it. I did end up adhering them with some of the raw polymer clay, like unbaked clay. I don't know if I thought this one through too well. I think I probably should have done this before putting them in the oven so that I could have baked that clay as well. But with the mushrooms and everything falling and kind of falling off and tilting, I did try and get it into the oven as quick as possible to avoid any distortion. Maybe I would have went with the crystals first and putting them in place. I think those would have baked fine. I think maybe in the future I would bake some little mushrooms off of the jar in shapes that I like and then adhere them with like a super glue or use the epoxy coating to adhere them to the jar. The way I did things definitely worked in the end if you go along things the way I did. This was definitely a learning curve and a lot of things I had to go back and fix or do a different way, but it really did turn out in the end. So if you don't have super crazy expectations for it and you're willing to work with the mistakes here and there, then I definitely think yours will turn out as well. Since I was going in with the raw clay to put the crystals on, I used it as well in a very thin way to fill in some cracks and creases that were formed. Some were that are just a little bit too big that I was worried about. Some little sections had fully fallen off the jar that were worrying me. And so I figured I would fill them in with some clay to hold them together. This was definitely one of those projects that I worked on that was an emotional roller coaster. It had some really high highs and some really low lows. And I find when I start to rush things or worry about how things are going, that's when I make a lot of problems for myself. But overall, I'm just so happy with how this one turned out that even looking back at this footage and seeing the hardships that I went through with it that at the time were so saddening, knowing how it turned out is a lot easier to look at this. It's definitely was worth it. So I gave the crystals quite a bit of a base. I wanted it to look like they were kind of shoved into the tree. I'm gonna cover most of their bases with moss, so I kind of put it a lot higher up on them. They're decently heavy, so I didn't want to risk them falling off. So I placed some clay underneath them. I pulled some clay up around them to like a quarter of the way up, some maybe a third of the way up, knowing that I was gonna cover that kind of weird insert with some moss and paint. Once I felt like I was pretty much done with all of the clay, I just wanted to clean up my space and get rid of that. This is the same mat I usually use one side for clay, as you can see it gets really covered in it, little bits of it, and then I use the other side for painting. So once everything was all ready, I got out all my paint stuff and started to plan that out. I use all acrylic paints for all of this. Since the majority of the jar is going to be brown, I start with a decent amount of brown paint and just kind of try and do the whole coverage of the jar. I avoid the inside of the crescent moon as I want it to be a lighter color, as if it's being carved out with a bark. I try to avoid any of the little mushrooms because most of the stems or the toadstools are going to be white. And then I avoid most of the clay going up the crystals since I don't want it to be harder to cover with the moss, as the moss would go over the white pretty well, but a dark brown might be a little bit harder. And then I avoid the inside of the top of the stump, as that is going to be also a lighter color brown. I filmed this last year and I'm not sure what happened to the rest of the footage or if I even filmed it, but after I paint this, I go in with a lighter color brown on the crescent moon in the inner areas. I add a little bit of white to some of the toadstools and mushrooms, and then I paint them red. I then go in with a Posca marker on the little dots of the mushrooms to make it a little bit easier. I will link everything below. And then I have a reindeer moss that I bought from Michael's as well, and I use hot glue to glue that around the little bases of the mushrooms, around the crystals, some little pieces on its own. I also used the Posca marker to go in and do some little stars and glitter kind of spots on the majority of the jar. And then when that was all done and dried, I went in with a UV resin epoxy that I got on Amazon, which I will link as well. And I coated the entire jar. Actually, I did that before I did the moss, so that it wouldn't all stick together. I used a UV resin because I didn't want it to drip, and I could dry it pretty quick in the sun or with a little UV lamp. This one was a little bit bigger of a piece, so I did find that the sun was a little bit better of a way to go, so I did a thin coat on certain sections. I tried not to do too thick of a coat because I'd created all these nice deep creases that were texture, and a little bit too much resin can get rid of those lines and kind of even them out. I found that it really structured the entire piece to use the UV resin. I did have to fix a couple pieces here and there as it was going. I found it really hard to open and close the lid without breaking off pieces. I then had replaced off pieces around the latch with raw clay and tried to UV coat over that, but it always stayed soft underneath and would crack the UV coat. So I found that very difficult. I don't know if I would recommend using a latch jar in the future. It was definitely a big struggle that I don't wish to put myself through again. I'm so happy with how it turned out, but the latch jar is just not for me. Once I glued the moss on after, I'm so happy with how it turned out. It's so cute and so fluffy. It's the cutest little ethereal fairy jar, and I'm so happy that it safely made it on its journey out west through the post office, and that my friend was able to enjoy it as much as I did. She sent me some amazing pictures of it, and I hope you enjoy this video footage of me putting the jar outside and just enjoying its beauty. I really hope you enjoyed hanging out with me and creating this mushroom stump fairy jar. I had so much fun creating it, and I'm so happy to share it with you guys. I'm happy that this is my first YouTube video that I can put out there showing you the stuff I'm trying, and I can't wait to share more videos of showing you how I created things that maybe I'm a little bit more confident in, and just trying new things, new projects that I love to do every couple weeks and months, and share this journey with you guys. I hope that you enjoyed it, and I would love if you would leave a comment on what you thought of it, especially if you tried it. I'd love to see how it went for you, and please like the video and subscribe and see what else I have in the future. Thank you. Bye.